6 months had passed since that terrible day when Rachel's world collided with Tom's in the most painful way possible. The memory of the hurt in his eyes still woke her up some nights, making her stomach twist with regret and shame. But today was different. Today, she was finally going to try to make things right. Rachel pulled into Tom's driveway in a simple blue pickup truck. Nothing like the expensive rental car that had broken down on that country road half a year ago. She'd traded in her sports car in Manhattan for this truck 3 months ago, along with most of her other expensive possessions. Her friends thought she'd lost her mind. But Rachel had never felt more clear about anything in her life. The farmhouse looked exactly the same, with Lucy's vegetable garden and the old dog sleeping under the maple tree. But Rachel noticed things were different too. There was a new coat of paint on the barn, and that leaning fence post had been straightened and reinforced. The fields looked healthier somehow, greener and more abundant than she remembered. She sat in the truck for a moment, gathering her courage. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say 100 times, but now that she was here, all her carefully planned words seemed inadequate. How do you apologize for deceiving people who showed you nothing but kindness? How do you ask for forgiveness when you represent everything they have reason to hate? Lucy appeared on the front porch, clearly pregnant now and glowing with health. When she recognized Rachel, her expression was a mixture of surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope. "Rachel?" Lucy called out, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. Rachel got out of the truck slowly, her hands shaking slightly. "Hi, Lucy. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, but I was hoping I could talk to you and Tom for a few minutes." Lucy studied her for a long moment, taking in Rachel's simple jeans and work shirt, so different from the expensive clothes she'd worn during her previous visit. "Tom's in the north field checking the irrigation. But you can wait if you want. I was just making some iced tea." The kitchen was exactly as Rachel remembered it, warm and welcoming despite the obvious tension in the air. Lucy moved carefully around the kitchen, her pregnancy clearly advanced. Rachel guessed she was probably due within the next month or two. "When are you expecting?" Rachel asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. 3 weeks, Lucy replied, pouring iced tea into the same mismatched glasses Rachel remembered from her first visit. "It's a boy. We're going to name him David after Tom's grandfather." "That's wonderful," Rachel said, and meant it. "You look happy." Lucy sat down across from her at the old kitchen table. "We are happy. Things have been better lately. Much better, actually." Rachel felt a small surge of hope. Maybe her work over the past 6 months had actually made a difference. Maybe she hadn't been too late to help. "Lucy, I owe you an apology," Rachel began, her voice shaking slightly. "Both you and Tom. I never meant to lie to you about who I was. When Tom stopped to help me that day, I was just a scared woman whose grandmother was in the hospital. Everything I told you about my childhood here, about loving this place, all of that was true. But I should have told you about my family's company." Lucy nodded slowly. "Tom was pretty hurt when he found out. Not because of who your family is, but because he felt like maybe our friendship wasn't real to you." "It was real," Rachel said earnestly. "It was the most real thing I'd experienced in years. Being here with your family, seeing how you live, how you treat each other and treat strangers. It changed everything for me." They heard the sound of Tom's truck coming up the drive. Lucy glanced toward the window and Rachel felt her stomach tighten with nerves. This was the moment she'd been both dreading and hoping for. Tom walked through the kitchen door and stopped short when he saw Rachel sitting at his table. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the wariness in his eyes, the same look he might give a snake that had wandered into his house. "Rachel," he said simply, hanging his hat on the hook by the door. "Hello, Tom." Rachel stood up, wrapping her hands around her glass of iced tea to stop them from shaking. "Thank you for letting me come. I know you have every reason to tell me to leave." Tom poured himself a glass of tea and sat down at the table, but he didn't look at her directly. "What brings you back to Iowa?" Rachel took a deep breath. This was it. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd fought with her father about, everything she'd risked her comfortable life to accomplish, all came down to this moment. "I came to tell you that I've left Blackstone Industries," she said. "Well, sort of. I'm still technically part of the company, but I've started a new division called the Family Farm Foundation. We're changing how the company does business with small farms." Tom's eyes finally met hers, and she could see skepticism mixed with cautious interest. "What kind of changes?" he asked. Rachel pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the table. Fair price guaranteed contracts for small and medium-sized farms. No more forcing people to sell when they can't meet impossible payment schedules. Interest-free equipment loans for farmers who need to upgrade or repair their machinery. And emergency assistance funds for families facing medical bills or natural disasters. Tom opened the folder and started reading, his expression growing more surprised with each page. Lucy leaned over to look too, her eyes widening. This says they're offering us a 10-year guaranteed contract at 15% above market rate, Lucy whispered. That's right, Rachel nodded. Your farm was selected as our pilot program. Not as charity, but as a genuine business partnership. We want to prove that supporting family farms is not just the right thing to do. It's good business, too. Tom looked up at her suspiciously. Why us? Why our farm specifically? Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Because 6 months ago, a farmer and his pregnant wife showed a complete stranger the kind of kindness I'd never experienced in my world of corporate boardrooms and million-dollar deals. Because you fed me at your table and gave me a safe place to sleep when I had nowhere else to go. Because you reminded me what really matters in life. Tom was quiet for a long moment, studying the contract papers. Your father approved this? Rachel laughed, but there was no humor in it. My father fought me every step of the way. He said I was being naive and sentimental. But I had help from some unexpected places. It turns out there are other people in the company who've been wanting to change how we do business. They just needed someone willing to stand up to the old ways. And if the pilot program fails? Tom asked. It won't fail, Rachel said with conviction, because it's based on treating people fairly instead of squeezing every last penny out of them. Because it's built on the idea that farming families are partners, not just sources of profit. Lucy was crying now, happy tears streaming down her face. Tom, this could save the farm. This could save everything. Tom reached over and took his wife's hand, then looked at Rachel with something approaching the warmth she remembered from their first meeting. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly, after the way I treated you that last day. You had every right to be angry, Rachel interrupted. I may not have meant to deceive you, but I did. And yes, I did have to do this, because I learned something from you and Lucy that no business school ever taught me. I learned that success isn't measured in dollars and profit margins. It's measured in whether you can sleep at night knowing you've done right by people. Tom stood up and extended his hand to Rachel. Partners? He asked. Rachel shook his hand, feeling like she was finally home. Partners. 3 weeks later, Rachel was back at the farm, this time as Lucy's labor coach when baby David decided to arrive 2 hours before the doctor could get there. As she held Tom and Lucy's son for the first time, looking into his tiny face in the kitchen where she'd first learned what real generosity looked like, Rachel knew she'd found her purpose. The family farm foundation had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. Dozens of farming families had joined the program, and other agricultural companies were starting to take notice. But more importantly, Rachel had found her way back to the person her grandmother Helen had raised her to be during those long-ago summers in Iowa. As she handed baby David back to his parents and watched Tom's face light up with pure joy, Rachel realized that sometimes the most important business deals aren't measured in dollars at all. Sometimes they're measured in hope, in second chances, and in the simple truth that helping others is the only investment that always pays dividends. Rachel woke up to the sound of roosters crowing and sunlight streaming through the small windows of the barn loft. For a moment she forgot where she was. The city girl in her had gotten used to waking up to car horns and sirens, not farm sounds. But as she stretched and looked around the cozy room, yesterday's events came flooding back. Her phone showed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, all from work. Her assistant had sent increasingly frantic messages about meetings she was supposed to attend and calls she was supposed to make. Rachel turned the phone face down on the bedside table. For the first time in years, work was going to have to wait. She could hear voices and activity coming from the main house. Through her window, she saw Tom in the distance, already working in the fields even though it was barely 7 in the morning. Lucy was hanging laundry on a line behind the house, moving carefully because of her pregnancy. Rachel got dressed in the clothes Lucy had loaned her the night before, simple jeans and a cotton shirt that felt strange after years of wearing business suits. When she looked in the small mirror, she hardly recognized herself. No makeup, no styled hair, no expensive jewelry. She looked younger somehow, more like the girl who used to spend summers with her grandmother. Lucy welcomed her into the kitchen with the same warmth as the night before. Coffee was already brewing and there were fresh eggs and homemade biscuits on the table. "How did you sleep, honey?" Lucy asked, pouring Rachel a cup of coffee in a chipped mug that said, "World's Greatest Dad" on the side. "Better than I have in months," Rachel admitted, and she meant it. "Thank you so much for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "Oh, nonsense," Lucy waved her hand dismissively. "It's what neighbors do for each other out here. Besides, it's nice to have another woman to talk to. Gets lonely sometimes with just Tom and me." Tom came in from the barn, his boots muddy and his shirt already damp with sweat despite the early hour. "Morning, Rachel. Sleep okay?" "Wonderfully, thank you." She watched him wash his hands at the kitchen sink, the same rough, honest hands that had fixed her car yesterday. "You're up early," Tom chuckled. "Cows don't care what time it is. They need to be milked twice a day, every day, whether it's Christmas morning or a blizzard. That's farming for you." After breakfast, Tom offered to drive Rachel back to her broken-down rental car. He'd picked up a replacement radiator hose from the auto parts store in town the evening before. Using money Rachel suspected he couldn't really afford to spare. "You don't have to pay for the parts," Rachel protested as they walked to his truck. "This is my problem." "It's $47, Tom said with a shrug. "Consider it a welcome to Iowa gift." $47. Rachel spent more than that on a single lunch in Manhattan. But she could see in Tom's face that this was a meaningful expense for him. Money that could have gone toward groceries or Lucy's doctor bills or the countless other expenses of keeping a farm running. They were halfway to where her car was stranded when Rachel's phone started ringing. She looked at the caller ID and felt her stomach drop. It was her father's personal number. "I should probably take this," she said reluctantly. "It's family." Tom nodded and turned down the radio to give her privacy. "Hi, Dad," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice normal. "Rachel, where the hell are you?" The voice on the other end was sharp with worry and frustration. "I've had 5 different people calling me asking where my daughter is. You missed the board meeting yesterday. You haven't returned any calls, and your assistant says you never came back to your hotel." Rachel closed her eyes. She'd completely forgotten about the board meeting. "I'm sorry, Dad. Grandma Helen had a heart attack yesterday. I'm in Iowa taking care of her." There was a pause on the other end. "Is she all right?" "She's stable. But Dad, I need to stay for a few more days. She's in the hospital and—" "Rachel, you can't just disappear like this. Do you have any idea what kind of position this puts me in? The Hartford acquisition meeting is tomorrow, and you're supposed to present the agricultural projections. Send Peterson. He knows the numbers as well as I do." "It's not about the numbers, Rachel. It's about responsibility, about showing up when people are counting on you." Rachel glanced at Tom, who was pretending not to listen but obviously couldn't help overhearing her father's raised voice through the phone. "I understand, Dad, but family comes first. Isn't that what you always taught me?" Her father's voice softened slightly. "Of course family comes first. But Helen isn't going anywhere, and this deal could be worth millions to the company. Can't you fly back for 1 day and then return?" "No, Dad. I'm staying here until she's better." "Fine. But I'm sending security to bring you back if I don't hear from you by tomorrow evening. I'm not losing a $50 million deal because my daughter decided to play farm girl for a week." The line went dead. Rachel stared at her phone, feeling sick to her stomach. In her world of corporate mergers and acquisitions, $50 million was just another deal. But sitting in this old pickup truck next to a man who was struggling to save his family's farm, it felt like blood money. Tom was quiet for a moment after she hung up. "Everything okay at home?" "Just work stuff," Rachel said weakly. "My father worries when I'm not in the office." "What kind of work keeps you so busy that you can't take a few days for family?" Rachel hesitated. She'd been dreading this question since yesterday. "I work in corporate finance. Mergers and acquisitions mostly." Tom nodded, but she could see him processing this information. "That sounds important." "It pays well," Rachel said, which wasn't really an answer. They reached her rental car, and Tom got to work on the radiator hose with the efficiency of someone who'd been fixing things his whole life. Rachel watched him work, thinking about how different his hands were from her father's. Her father had soft, manicured hands that had never touched a tool or gotten dirty with honest work. "There you go," Tom said, closing the hood. "Good as new." Well, good as rented anyway. Rachel started the car and the engine purred smoothly. Tom, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done. You and Lucy saved my life yesterday. Just glad we could help. Tom wiped his hands on an old rag. You take care of your grandmother and don't worry about us. We'll be just fine. As Tom drove away in his pickup truck, Rachel sat in her rental car feeling more alone than she had in years. She was supposed to follow him back to the farm to collect her things and say goodbye to Lucy before driving back to the hospital. But before she could start driving, she heard the sound of vehicles approaching. 3 black SUVs came around the curve, moving fast and kicking up dust from the gravel road. Rachel's heart sank as she recognized the lead vehicle. Her father had found her. The SUVs pulled over in a line behind her car and men in dark suits got out. Her father emerged from the middle vehicle, his expression a mixture of relief and anger. Behind him came his head of security, 2 assistants, and what looked like half the executive protection team from Blackstone Industries. Rachel, her father said, striding toward her car, thank God you're safe. When your GPS showed you were stranded on some back road, I thought the worst. Robert Blackstone was the kind of man who commanded attention wherever he went. Expensive suit, perfect hair, the confidence that came from building a billion-dollar empire from nothing. He looked completely out of place on this rural Iowa road. Dad, what are you doing here? Rachel got out of her car, acutely aware of her borrowed clothes and the fact that she probably smelled like hay from sleeping in the barn loft. I'm here because my daughter disappeared without a trace, he said, pulling her into a tight hug. Do you have any idea how worried I've been? Just then, Tom's pickup truck came back around the curve. He must have forgotten something or wanted to make sure her car was running properly. When he saw the convoy of black vehicles, he slowed down, clearly confused and concerned. Tom got out of his truck and walked toward them, his work clothes and muddy boots making him look like he'd stepped out of a different century compared to the men in suits. Rachel, is everything all right? Tom asked, his eyes scanning the security team with obvious suspicion. Tom, this is my father, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad, this is Tom Morrison. He's the man who helped me yesterday when my car broke down. Robert Blackstone studied Tom for a moment, taking in the work clothes, the calloused hands, the honest face that had shown his daughter more kindness than most people in her corporate world ever had. Mr. Morrison, Robert said, extending his hand. I can't thank you enough for helping my daughter. Tom shook the offered hand, but Rachel could see confusion in his eyes. Your daughter? Rachel Blackstone, her father said proudly. Executive Vice President of Blackstone Industries. The color drained from Tom's face. Rachel watched as understanding dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like betrayal. Blackstone Industries. The same company that had bought out 3 farms in his county just last year. The same company whose policies he'd complained about over dinner last night, not knowing he was talking to one of the people responsible for making those policies. You're Rachel Blackstone, Tom said slowly, like he was trying to process impossible information. Rachel nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. Tom, I wanted to tell you, but... Rachel rushed through the hospital doors with Tom right behind her, her high heels clicking frantically on the polished floor. The antiseptic smell and bright fluorescent lights made everything feel cold and scary. At the information desk, a kind-faced nurse directed them to the cardiac unit on the 3rd floor. When the elevator doors opened, Rachel's heart was pounding almost as hard as it had been during the car ride. She approached the nurse's station with shaky legs, and Tom stayed a respectful distance back, giving her space for this private family moment. I'm looking for Helen Martinez, Rachel said to the nurse behind the desk. She was brought in earlier today with a heart attack. I'm her granddaughter. The nurse's expression softened. Room 314, honey. She's stable now, but she's sleeping. The doctor will want to talk to you about her condition. Rachel nearly collapsed with relief. Stable. That was the most beautiful word she'd heard all day. She turned to Tom, her eyes filled with grateful tears. She's okay. She's going to be okay. Tom smiled, feeling genuinely happy for this woman he'd only met a few hours ago. That's wonderful news. I'm so glad. Dr. Peterson, a tired-looking man in his 50s, explained that Helen had suffered a mild heart attack, but was responding well to treatment. However, they wanted to keep her for observation for at least 2 days, maybe 3, to make sure her heart rhythm stayed stable and to adjust her medications. Rachel sat beside her grandmother's bed for the next 2 hours, holding her wrinkled hand and watching her sleep peacefully. Helen looked so small in the hospital bed, smaller than Rachel remembered. When she'd been a child, her grandmother had seemed like the strongest person in the world, capable of anything. Now she looked fragile, like she might break if Rachel held her hand too tightly. As visiting hours came to an end, reality started to sink in. Rachel had flown in from New York that morning with just a small overnight bag, planning to stay one night and fly back the next day. But now her grandmother would be in the hospital for several days, and Rachel's rental car was still broken down on that country road, 45 minutes away. Tom had been waiting patiently in the hallway, reading an old farming magazine and checking his phone occasionally. When Rachel finally emerged from her grandmother's room, she looked lost and overwhelmed again. "How is she?" Tom asked gently. "Better, much better. But they want to keep her for a few days and Rachel's voice trailed off as she realized her predicament. "I don't know what I'm going to do. The nearest hotel is in the next county and I don't have a car and I can't just leave her here alone." Tom studied her face for a moment. He thought about Lucy waiting at home, probably wondering where he was. He thought about all the evening chores he still needed to do and how early he'd have to get up tomorrow. But he also thought about his own grandmother and how grateful he would have been if a stranger had helped him when she was sick. "Listen," he said carefully, "I know this might sound strange, but my wife and I have a guest room. Well, it's actually a converted loft above our barn, but it's comfortable and clean. You're welcome to stay there tonight, and tomorrow we can figure out how to get your car fixed." Rachel stared at him in disbelief. "I can't ask you to do that. You've already done so much, and I'm a complete stranger. Your wife doesn't even know me." "Lucy will understand," Tom said, and he meant it. "She's got a kind heart just like her grandmother did. Besides, it's the right thing to do. No one should have to deal with this kind of situation alone." The drive back to Tom's farm was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the drive to the hospital had been. Rachel was emotionally drained from the stress of the day, and she found herself really looking at the countryside for the first time. In the early evening light, everything looked softer somehow. The cornstalks swayed gently in the breeze, and the old farmhouses they passed seemed cozy and welcoming rather than shabby and outdated. When they pulled into Tom's driveway, a woman came out onto the porch. She was clearly pregnant, with a gentle smile and flower on her apron. This had to be Lucy, and Rachel felt a surge of nervousness about intruding on this family's life. Lucy Morrison was the kind of person who made everyone feel welcome within 5 minutes of meeting her. She hugged Rachel like they were old friends, insisted she was no trouble at all, and immediately started fussing about getting her something to eat. "You must be starving," Lucy said, leading them into the kitchen. "Tom called and told me a little bit about what happened. I'm so sorry about your grandmother, but I'm glad she's doing better." The kitchen was warm and inviting, with hand-sewn curtains and the smell of something delicious in the oven. Rachel realized she hadn't eaten anything since a small bag of pretzels on the plane that morning. Her stomach growled loudly and she felt embarrassed. "That's just the pot roast you're smelling," Lucy laughed. "I made extra, thank goodness. It's nothing fancy, but it's filling." As Lucy bustled around setting another place at the table, Rachel noticed things she hadn't paid attention to before. The kitchen table was old and scarred, but it was clean and polished. The dishes didn't match, like they'd been collected over many years from different sets. There was a stack of unpaid bills on the counter, partially hidden under a dish towel. During dinner, Rachel found herself relaxing for the first time in months. Tom and Lucy talked about their day, their plans for the baby, funny stories about their neighbors. It was the kind of normal, comfortable conversation Rachel hadn't experienced since she was a child visiting her grandmother. "How long have you two been married?" Rachel asked, twirling pot roast on her fork. 8 years this October," Lucy replied, smiling at Tom. "We were high school sweethearts, broke up when I went to college, got back together when I realized I was too stubborn for my own good." Tom laughed. "She was going to be a teacher, but then her mom got sick and she came back to help take care of her. That's when we reconnected." "I still think about teaching sometimes," Lucy admitted. "But the farm keeps us busy, and now with the baby coming." She placed a protective hand over her rounded belly. After dinner, Rachel insisted on helping with the dishes despite Lucy's protests. As she washed the mismatched plates and glasses, she listened to Lucy and Tom discuss their plans for the next day. Tom needed to check on the irrigation system in the north field, and Lucy had a doctor's appointment in town. "I'm worried about the electric bill," Lucy said quietly, not realizing Rachel could hear. "It went up again this month." "We'll figure it out," Tom replied, but Rachel could hear the stress in his voice. "We always do." "The baby's going to need so many things," Lucy continued. "A crib, a car seat, diapers. And if something happens during the delivery like it did with my sister..." Tom put his arms around his wife. "Hey, don't borrow trouble. Dr. Williams says you're doing great. Everything's going to be fine." Rachel dried the dishes slowly, pretending not to listen, but every word hit her like a physical blow. These people had opened their home to a complete stranger, fed her a delicious meal, and offered her comfort in her time of need. And they were struggling with bills that Rachel spent on lunch without thinking twice. She thought about her apartment in Manhattan, which cost more per month than Tom probably made in 3. She thought about her designer clothes and expensive shoes and the fact that she'd complained to her coworkers just last week about having to fly coach instead of first class. When the dishes were done, Tom led her out to the converted barn loft. It was simple but charming, with a comfortable bed, handmade quilts, and windows that looked out over the moonlit fields. Lucy had put fresh flowers from her garden in a mason jar on the bedside table. "I hope you'll be comfortable here," Tom said. "If you need anything, just holler. We're early risers, so don't worry about waking us up." After Tom left, Rachel sat on the bed and looked around the room. Everything was clean and welcoming, but she could see the careful way money had been spent. The furniture was old but well maintained. The quilts were obviously homemade. Even the soap in the small bathroom was generic brand. She pulled out her phone to check her messages and saw dozens of missed calls and texts from her office. People wondering where she was, asking about meetings and deadlines and client calls. The problems that had seemed so important that morning now felt trivial and meaningless. Rachel walked to the window and looked out at the field stretching endlessly under the stars. In New York, she could never see this many stars because of all the city lights. Here, the sky was dark and vast and beautiful in a way she'd completely forgotten. For the first time in years, Rachel felt ashamed of her life. Not ashamed of her success or her education, but ashamed of how disconnected she'd become from real people and real problems. Tom and Lucy were facing genuine hardship, the kind that kept you awake at night worrying about paying bills and providing for your family. And yet they'd welcomed her with open hearts and open hands, asking nothing in return. As she got ready for bed and clothes Lucy had kindly loaned her, Rachel made a silent promise to her sleeping grandmother and to herself. She didn't know what she could do to help Tom and Lucy, but she was going to figure something out. These good people had shown her what real generosity looked like, and she needed to find a way to pay it forward. Outside, she could hear the gentle sounds of the countryside settling. Tom opened the passenger door of his old pickup truck and immediately felt embarrassed. The seat was covered with a faded towel to hide the torn upholstery, and there were muddy work gloves on the dashboard along with empty coffee cups and gas station receipts. The whole cab smelled like soil, diesel fuel, and the bologna sandwich he'd eaten for lunch. "I'm sorry about the mess," he said, quickly gathering up the clutter. "This isn't exactly what you're used to, I'm guessing." The woman climbed into the truck carefully, trying not to snag her expensive clothes on anything. Her high heels clicked against the metal step, and Tom realized she was probably going to ruin those shoes before the day was over. She settled into the seat and pulled her purse close to her chest, like she was holding on to the last piece of her normal world. "Thank you so much for this," she said as Tom started the engine. "I'm Rachel, by the way. Rachel Chen. I should have introduced myself earlier." "Nice to meet you, Rachel. Tom Morrison, like I said." He pulled back onto the road, his truck making a grinding sound as he shifted gears. "Don't worry about the introductions. You've got bigger things on your mind right now." As they drove, Tom glanced over at Rachel every few seconds. She was staring out the window at the endless fields of corn and soybeans, but he could tell she wasn't really seeing them. Her hands were shaking slightly and she kept checking her phone even though she'd said the battery was almost dead. "Tell me about your grandmother," Tom said gently, figuring it might help her to talk. "If you don't mind me asking." Rachel's eyes filled with tears again, but she took a deep breath and nodded. "Her name is Helen Martinez. She's 86 years old and the strongest person I've ever known. When I was little, I used to spend every summer with her in Cedar Falls. She lived in this tiny white house on Maple Street, with a garden that seemed huge to me back then." Tom smiled. "I know Maple Street. Nice neighborhood. Lots of old houses with character. That's the one. Grandma Helen taught me how to plant vegetables and how to can peaches and how to make the best apple pie in 3 counties. At least that's what she always claimed. Rachel managed a small laugh through her tears. I haven't been back to visit in almost 3 years. I kept meaning to, but work kept getting in the way, and then the pandemic happened and there was always some excuse. Tom nodded, understanding more than Rachel probably realized. Life has a way of keeping us busy, doesn't it? Sometimes we forget what's really important until something like this happens. They drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes, passing by farmhouses and barns that had seen better days. Tom noticed Rachel looking at everything with curious eyes now, like she was really seeing it for the first time. "This all used to be so familiar to me," she said. "When I was a kid, I thought this was the most beautiful place on earth. All these fields and the way the sky looked so big and endless. But somewhere along the way I started thinking of it as, I don't know, backwards, I guess. Too simple. Too quiet," Tom chuckled. "City life change your perspective?" Something like that. I live in Manhattan now. Work in finance. Every day is about numbers and deadlines and making more money than the day before. It's exciting, but it's also... She paused, searching for the right words. Exhausting. I can't remember the last time I actually looked at the sky. Tom pointed out the windshield to where the sun was starting to sink lower on the horizon, painting the clouds in soft shades of orange and pink. "Well, you're looking at one of the best skies in America right there. No skyscrapers to block the view out here." Rachel stared at the sunset and was quiet for a long moment. "It really is beautiful. I'd forgotten." "What kind of work do you do in the city?" Tom asked. "I work for an investment firm. We handle portfolios for big companies, help them decide where to put their money to get the best returns. Agriculture is actually one of our major sectors." Rachel's voice took on a more professional tone, like she was giving a presentation. "The agricultural industry generates billions of dollars annually, and there are always opportunities for growth and expansion." Tom's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. He'd heard that kind of talk before, usually from people who had never gotten dirt under their fingernails or worried about whether the rain would come at the right time. "That's interesting," he said carefully. "What kind of opportunities?" "Oh, consolidation mostly. Helping larger agricultural corporations acquire smaller, less efficient operations. Streamlining production, reducing overhead costs, maximizing yield per acre, basic business principles." Rachel seemed to realize how that might sound to someone like Tom. "I'm sorry, you probably don't want to hear about all that business stuff." Tom was quiet for a moment, thinking about his own farm and how many of his neighbors had been bought out by big corporations over the years. "Actually, I'm curious. Do you ever think about the families that used to run those smaller operations?" Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I mean, change is inevitable, right? In any industry. The market rewards efficiency and innovation. It's not personal." "No, I suppose it's not," Tom said, but his voice was a little cooler now, at least not to the people making the decisions. They drove past Tom's own farm and he slowed down slightly. The house looked small and tired compared to the grand estates Rachel was probably used to, but it was home. The paint was peeling on the barn, and one of the fence posts was leaning at an odd angle. He'd been meaning to fix that for months. "That's my place," he said, nodding toward the house. Rachel looked at the farmhouse with its wraparound porch and the vegetable garden, where Lucy grew tomatoes and green beans. There were chickens pecking around in the yard and an old dog sleeping in the shade of a maple tree. "It looks so peaceful," she said, and there was something wistful in her voice. "How long has your family lived here?" 5 generations. My great-great-grandfather homesteaded this land back in 1889, started with 40 acres and built everything you see with his own hands." Tom felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with worry. "We're up to about 300 acres now, but it's getting harder every year to make it work." "What do you mean?" Tom sighed. "Costs keep going up, but the prices we get for our crops don't. Seed, fertilizer, equipment, fuel. Everything's more expensive than it was last year. And the weather's been unpredictable. Too much rain, then not enough, then too much again. Last year we lost about 30% of our corn crop to a hailstorm that lasted 15 minutes. Rachel listened quietly, and Tom found himself talking more than he'd intended. "My wife Lucy is pregnant with our first child," he continued. "Due in about 4 months. I want to give that baby the same kind of childhood I had, running around these fields learning about the land, but I don't know if the farm will still be here by the time he's old enough to care about it. What would happen if you couldn't keep the farm? Tom's jaw tightened. The bank's been pretty clear about that. If we can't make our payments, they'll foreclose. Some big agricultural corporation will probably buy it at auction for a fraction of what it's worth. Tear down the house and the barn, and turn it into one giant field managed by computers and machines. The truck was quiet except for the sound of the engine and the tires on the asphalt. Rachel stared out at the passing farmland with new eyes, seeing not just pretty scenery but the lives and dreams and generations of work that had gone into every acre. I never really thought about it that way, she said softly. Most people don't, Tom replied. Can't say I blame them. It's easier to think about numbers on a spreadsheet than real people losing everything their families built. As they approached the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Tom glanced over at Rachel. She was looking at her hands, which were soft and manicured, so different from his own rough, scarred fingers. I'm sorry, she said suddenly, for what I said earlier. About efficiency and market forces and all that. I never thought about the human cost. Tom's expression softened. You weren't wrong about the business side of things. It's just that for folks like me, it's not just business. It's home. The hospital came into view ahead of them, a modern building that looked out of place among the small-town storefronts and tree-lined residential streets. Tom pulled into the parking lot and found a spot near the main entrance. Here we are, he said, turning off the engine. I hope your grandmother is okay. Rachel sat for a moment before opening the door, looking like she was gathering her courage. Tom, I can't thank you enough for this. You saved my life today, literally. I don't know how I can ever repay you. Tom smiled. Just take care of your grandmother. That's payment enough. The sun was beating down hard that Tuesday afternoon, and Tom wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his dirty sleeve. His old blue pickup truck rumbled down the country road, the engine making that familiar rattling sound it had been making for the past 2 years. He kept telling himself he'd get it fixed when things got better on the farm, but somehow things never seemed to get better. The farmer's market had been disappointing again today. Only sold half his corn and tomatoes, barely enough to cover the gas money for the trip into town. People just weren't buying like they used to. Everyone seemed to be shopping at those big chain stores now, where everything looked perfect and shiny, even if it didn't taste half as good as what came from his family's soil. Tom was 34 years old, but his hands looked like they belonged to someone much older. Years of working the land had left them rough and scarred, with dirt permanently embedded under his fingernails no matter how hard he scrubbed. His wife Lucy always joked that he could shower for an hour and still look like he'd been wrestling with the earth. She wasn't wrong. The Morrison farm had been in his family for over 100 years. His great-great-grandfather had started with just 40 acres and a dream. Now Tom was working nearly 300 acres, but somehow making less money than his ancestor ever did. The bills kept piling up, the equipment kept breaking down, and the bank kept calling. As he rounded the bend near Miller's Creek, something caught his eye up ahead. A black car was pulled off to the side of the road, and there was white steam or smoke coming from under the hood. Tom slowed down automatically. His father had raised him to never pass by someone in trouble, especially not out here where cell phone service was spotty and help could be miles away. Getting closer, he could see it was one of those expensive sedans, the kind that probably cost more than he made in 2 years. The paint job was so perfect it almost hurt to look at in the bright sunlight. But what really caught his attention was the woman standing next to it. She was pacing back and forth, talking rapidly into her phone, and even from a distance Tom could tell she was upset. Her voice was getting higher and more frantic with each word. She was wearing clothes that definitely weren't made for country roads. A crisp white blouse and a dark skirt that probably cost more than Tom's entire wardrobe. Her shoes had tall heels that kept sinking into the soft dirt at the road's edge. Tom pulled his truck over about 20 feet behind her car and sat there for a moment, wondering if he should get involved. The woman looked like she came from a completely different world than his. She probably had roadside assistance and credit cards and all sorts of ways to handle this kind of problem. What could a dirt-poor farmer possibly offer someone like that? But then he heard her voice crack and he could see her shoulders shaking. She was crying now, and something about the sound made his chest tight. It reminded him of the time his sister got lost at the county fair when they were kids. That same desperate, scared sound that made you want to help no matter what. Tom turned off his engine and climbed out of the truck. His boots hit the gravel with a crunch and the woman spun around to look at him. Her eyes were red and puffy, and her perfectly styled hair was starting to come undone in the heat. "Excuse me, ma'am," Tom said, keeping his distance and trying to make his voice as gentle as possible. "Looks like you might be having some car trouble. I'm Tom Morrison. I live just down the road a piece. Is there anything I can do to help?" The woman stared at him for a moment like she was trying to figure out if he was real. Then her phone made a beeping sound and she looked down at it with panic in her eyes. "My phone is dying," she said, and her voice was shaky. "I've been trying to call for help, but I can't get through to anyone. The car just started smoking and making terrible noises, and then it just stopped." She gestured helplessly at the sedan. Tom nodded and walked over to look at the car. He didn't know much about fancy vehicles, but he knew enough about engines to recognize trouble when he saw it. The hood was warm to the touch, and there was definitely coolant leaking onto the ground underneath. "Mind if I take a look under the hood?" he asked. The woman nodded quickly. "Please, yes. I'll take any help I can get right now." Tom popped the hood and immediately saw the problem. One of the radiator hoses had burst and coolant was everywhere. It wasn't the kind of thing you could fix on the roadside, especially not without the right parts. "Well, I've got some good news and some bad news," Tom said, straightening up and wiping his hands on his jeans. "The good news is it's not anything too serious. Just a busted radiator hose. The bad news is you're not going anywhere in this car today." The woman's face went white. "What do you mean?" "There has to be something you can do. I have to get to Cedar Falls Medical Center. My grandmother is in the hospital. She had a heart attack and they said I need to get there as soon as possible." Tom felt his heart sink. He knew that hospital. It was a good 45 minutes away on these winding country roads. "I'm real sorry to hear about your grandmother, ma'am, but this hose is split wide open. Even if I had a replacement, which I don't, it would take time to install and you'd need to let the engine cool down first." The woman sat down hard on the bumper of her car, putting her head in her hands. "I can't believe this is happening. I flew in from New York this morning, rented this car at the airport, and I've been driving for hours trying to find this place. I haven't seen my grandmother in 3 years, and now when she needs me most, I'm stuck on the side of some road in the middle of nowhere." Tom stood there for a moment, watching this woman who seemed so out of place in his world fall apart. He thought about Lucy waiting at home with dinner, probably wondering where he was. He thought about all the work he still needed to do before dark. He thought about how tired he was and how his back ached from loading and unloading produce all day. But then he thought about his own grandmother, who had passed away 2 winters ago. He remembered how much he would have given for one more chance to see her, to tell her he loved her, to hold her hand one more time. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I've got a truck. It's not fancy and it's not clean, but it runs just fine. I'd be happy to drive you to the hospital." The woman looked up at him with surprise. "You would do that? You don't even know me." Tom shrugged. "Don't need to know you to know you're hurting. My truck can have you at that hospital in 45 minutes. That's got to be better than sitting here waiting for a tow truck that might not come until tomorrow." For the first time since he'd stopped, the woman smiled. It was small and shaky, but it was real. "I don't know what to say. That's incredibly kind of you, but I don't want to impose. You probably have your own family waiting for you." "They'll understand," Tom said, and he meant it. Lucy had married a farmer, which meant she'd married someone who couldn't ignore people in need. "Let me just call my wife and let her know I'll be late." As Tom pulled out his old flip phone, he noticed the woman staring at it with amazement, like she'd never seen one before. He realized she was probably used to those fancy smartphones that did everything but wash your dishes. "Ready when you are, ma'am," he said after leaving a quick message for Lucy. "We'll get you to your grandmother."